There is a quiet shift happening inside the financial machinery of the United States, one so immense that most people will not grasp its meaning until the consequences are already sitting in their bank accounts. At this very moment, the U.S. government owes more than $37 trillion, a figure unprecedented not only in America's history, but in the history of civilization itself. It is more debt than the world economy produced in an entire year just decades ago. And the most unsettling truth is this: no one in power is preparing to pay it back. Not in the way the public assumes. Instead, a different plan is unfolding, one that doesn't involve default austerity or massive tax hikes, and far easier to hide, the engineered devaluation of the U.S. dollar through the deliberate revaluation of government-controlled assets. What makes this strategy so difficult for the public to detect is that it doesn't look like theft. It doesn't resemble a traditional crisis. Instead, it unfolds the same way it is throughout history, quietly, strategically, and framed as a necessary step to restore stability. And the tools being used today are not limited to gold, the centuries-old anchor of monetary resets. For the first time, the U.S. government is preparing to use the pillars crypto and gold to execute the most complex debt elimination maneuver ever attempted. To understand how this works, imagine the difference between the way a household handles debt and how a sovereign power does. When you fall behind on your bills, you must work more hours, liquidate assets, or cut living expenses. But a government that issues its own currency operates under a different set of rules entirely. A sovereign nation can manipulate the very denominator in which its obligations are measured. This is the ultimate advantage of controlling the money supply. When debts can't be paid, you change the value of the currency itself. Governments have relied on this tactic again and again whenever their financial backs are against the wall, because it reveals the exact formula being revived today, only modernized, scaled up, and hidden behind new technology. In the early 1930s, after the ravages of World War I and the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the United States found itself drowning in debt. Deflation was strangling the economy, and the real value of government debt was rising with each passing month. It had surged above 40%, a figure that terrified policymakers at a time when the economy was evaporating beneath their feet. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a nation on the brink. He realized something brutal but essential: the government could not pay its debts at the existing value of the dollar. And so he executed one of the most dramatic monetary resets in American history. Through Executive Order 6102, Roosevelt made it illegal for citizens to own most forms of physical gold. Individuals were required to surrender their gold to the government in exchange for paper dollars at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. Most Americans complied, believing it was a patriotic act to support national recovery. But what they didn't know was that the government was preparing the second half of the plan. Roosevelt redefined the official price of gold to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase, pushed through by the stroke of a pen. Overnight, the government's gold reserves surged in value from roughly $4 billion to nearly $7 billion. In an instant, billions of dollars in new balance sheet value had been created out of thin air. This wasn't a magic trick. It was strategic revaluation. The government had converted an unpayable debt burden into something manageable, simply by altering the price of the asset backing the currency. And while the federal balance sheet strengthened, ordinary citizens paid the hidden cost. The savings they thought were secure were quietly diluted through the inflation that followed. People who had been forced to surrender their gold at $20.67 watched it soar to $35. But owning it was illegal, so they could not benefit. The wealth transfer was complete. Value moved upward to the government. This is the blueprint. The differences are in scale, technology, and subtlety, but the underlying mechanism is identical, higher than at any point in American history except World War II. And if interest rates remain elevated, those payments will surge to nearly $1.8 trillion by 2027. In other words, the United States is paying more to service its debt each year than it spends on the military, on Medicare, and on most other federal programs. And unlike World War II, there is no post-war economic boom waiting on the other side. Everyone at the highest levels of government knows the truth. This debt cannot be paid through conventional means. You cannot grow your way out of it, and you cannot cut spending enough to make a dent without collapsing essential systems. So the same choice governments have always made when the math becomes impossible is being made again: the choice to devalue the currency itself. But here is where the strategy becomes more sophisticated than anything attempted in the past. Not just gold, but Bitcoin, a digital asset most people still believe exists outside the reach of governments. This is where the story takes a turn most people are not prepared for. In January 2025, a new executive order established what is now known as the U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. On the surface, the order was framed as a move to keep America competitive in the digital age, to maintain leadership in cryptocurrency innovation, and to prevent economic rivals like China from dominating the space. But beneath that official language lies a much more consequential goal: the creation of a new asset. The government can revalue at will. Right now, the U.S. government holds roughly 210,000 Bitcoin seized through criminal prosecutions, darknet shutdowns, ransomware cases, and major exchange crackdowns. At a price of around $100,000 per coin, these holdings are worth more than $20 billion. But this amount is merely a foundation. Senator Cynthia Lummis has proposed a target of 1 million Bitcoin to be accumulated over 5 years, not primarily through open market purchases, but through quiet, strategic acquisition methods that do not move the price. This includes future seizures, fines, settlement agreements, and perhaps even federally backed mining operations. Strain what policymakers will call a stability emergency. The government can announce a revaluation of its Bitcoin holdings for strategic reserve purposes. Instead of valuing Bitcoin at the market rate, overnight, 1 million Bitcoin purchased or seized at low cost could translate into $1 trillion in new government asset value. As Bitcoin revalues upward, the dollar revalues downward, backed by the full authority of the U.S. Treasury. Gold, the oldest form of monetary anchor, remains the centerpiece of global central bank reserves. But on the government's books, that gold is still valued at the statutory price of $40.22 per ounce, a figure that has not changed since 1973. This is not an oversight, it is a strategic advantage. It leaves massive room for a revaluation event. The government's gold reserves would instantly transform from an $11 billion accounting entry into an asset worth more than $5 trillion. The government could generate $6 trillion or more new balance sheet power without raising taxes, without cutting programs, and without triggering an official default. This is not a side effect, it is the mechanism itself. A person with $100,000 in savings might wake up a few years later to discover their money buys only a fraction of what it once did. This is how debt is erased by dissolving the real value of the currency in which the debt is denominated. This reset has happened before. It has been executed in Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and many others. The U.S. avoided this fate in 1933 only by controlling the world's reserve currency. To understand why this new reset is unfolding so predictably, we need to revisit the historical pattern in more detail, because the actions being taken by the U.S. government today are almost a 0.4-point rerun of the 1930s. What looks like innovation on the surface is actually a modern recreation of the exact same mechanism Roosevelt used 90 years ago. And the parallels are so precise that once you see them, it becomes impossible to ignore the direction things are headed. In 1933, the United States dollar was still tied directly to gold. Every dollar represented a claim on a fixed quantity of the metal. That link was a double-edged sword. It gave the dollar strength, but it also prevented the government from manipulating the currency to relieve debt pressure. As deflation took hold and the economy collapsed, the value of gold relative to goods and services surged. This strengthened the purchasing power of gold, but it also magnified the government's debt burden. With federal revenues shrinking, Washington had only two choices: default openly or manipulate the currency indirectly. Roosevelt chose the latter. The first step was seizing the gold supply. Citizens were forced to exchange their gold for paper currency at the official price. Most people did not understand what was coming next, but Roosevelt did. Once the government had taken control of the nation's gold, in 1934, Roosevelt raised the official price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35. The value of the government's gold reserves increased by billions of dollars. That had previously been crushing suddenly appeared manageable. The dollar's purchasing power dropped, and years of inflation followed, without realizing that the inflation was not a natural consequence of recovery, it was the intended outcome of the revaluation. Now, fast forward to the present. Today's version of the 1930 for revaluation is the statutory undervaluation of gold at $40 per ounce on the government's books. And today's version of the gold standard reset is the creation of a dual asset reserve structure. This is not speculation. It is happening in real time. The United States currently values its gold reserves at a price that is absurdly disconnected from reality, not because of error, but because carrying gold at an artificially low valuation gives the government tremendous leverage, but keeping the book value low. And when it does, the impact on the government's balance sheet will be explosive. Let me show you how extreme the undervaluation is. But on the government's official balance sheet, it is deliberate strategic positioning, because when the time comes, the government can raise the statutory gold price to any number it chooses, $10,000 per ounce, If the new official price were set at $20,000, in an instant, the national debt burden would appear far smaller. Now imagine this happening at the same time as a Bitcoin revaluation. The government declares that its strategic Bitcoin reserve will be valued at $1 million per coin. For reserve accounting, if the government holds 1 million coins, the new valuation would be $1 trillion. Combined with gold, the government would create more than $6 trillion in new asset value overnight. Just as in 1934, the value is created not through productivity or innovation, but through redefinition. This is not theoretical. It is not far-fetched. It is the logical, mathematical, and historical solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. When debt becomes too large, governments revalue their assets and devalue their currency. It has happened in the United States before, and it is happening again. But here is where the modern version differs in scale. In 1934, the revaluation helped the government manage a debt burden that was a fraction of today's. The 2020's debt load is so immense that gold alone cannot close the gap. That is why Bitcoin is entering the equation. For the first time in history, many Americans still view cryptocurrency as something outside the reach of government, a decentralized system immune to political manipulation. But that perception is naive. Governments manipulate anything they can seize, regulate, compel, or redefine. When the U.S. establishes a Bitcoin reserve and legally defines its role in national security and monetary stability, Bitcoin becomes a tool of statecraft. And like all tools of statecraft, it can be used to quietly transfer wealth. This is where the concept of strategic asset revaluation becomes essential. Bitcoin and gold will be positioned as anchors of a new monetary order, not because they are inherently more stable, but because they provide the perfect mechanism to disguise a currency devaluation. When the government raises the value of these assets, the dollar's value naturally falls. And when the dollar falls, the real weight of the government's debt declines with it. If you owe a debt in dollars and the value of the dollar drops, the real burden of your debt shrinks. If your savings are in dollars and the value of the dollar drops, the real value of your savings shrinks. This is, in effect, a transfer of wealth from savers to the government. It is a form of inflation, but not the kind that arises from market forces or economic overheating. It is calculated, it is intentional, and it is executed through the repricing of strategic reserves. Now, let's examine how deeply this strategy is already embedded in U.S. economic policy. In December 2024, Senator Cynthia Lummis introduced legislation proposing that the U.S. acquire up to 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. The proposal received bipartisan interest not because lawmakers are suddenly excited about cryptocurrency, but because they understand the severity of the debt crisis. Both major political parties know the truth. $37 trillion cannot be repaid through taxation, spending cuts, or growth. It must be eliminated through devaluation. And so, under the guise of innovation and strategic planning, the public is told the policy is about modernization. In reality, it is about survival. In January 2025, the executive order creating the strategic Bitcoin reserve was signed. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was the first structural step toward incorporating Bitcoin into the federal balance sheet as a manipulable asset just like gold has been for generations. This brings us to the second half of the coming reset, the move toward a partially gold-backed dollar. There has been an increasing chorus advocating for a return to sound money, a currency backed by hard assets rather than faith alone. On the surface, this appears to be a conservative desire to restore stability, but underneath, it serves as the perfect justification for revaluing gold. You cannot back the dollar with gold at $2,800 per ounce. The government does not have enough gold to make that mathematically viable. But at $20,000 per ounce, the gold supply suddenly appears sufficient to support a partially backed currency system. A revaluation marketed as fiscal discipline is actually a strategic devaluation of the dollar. And while the government rebuilds its balance sheet, the everyday American watches their living standard decline. The same mechanism that saved the government in 1934 is returning only this time. It has a digital counterpart. To see where this is heading, we need to examine the present reality of America's financial position, because the pressures pushing the U.S. toward a reset are not abstract or hypothetical. They are deeply mathematical, unavoidable, and accelerating faster than most people realize. The United States is currently burdened with $37 trillion in federal debt. This number is so large that it surpasses the combined GDP of the world's 10 largest economies, only 2 decades ago. But the raw number is not even the most alarming part. The real danger lies in the trajectory of that debt and the cost of maintaining it. Interest alone now consumes over $1.2 trillion every year, making it one of the largest federal expenditures. Unless interest rates drop dramatically, that figure will climb toward $1.8 trillion annually by 2027. To put that in perspective, the United States will soon spend more servicing its debt than it does on defense, Medicare, or any program outside Social Security. And unlike other expenses, interest cannot be negotiated, reduced, or ignored. It must be paid every year until the debt itself is extinguished, which is mathematically impossible under the current system. This is the point where governments throughout history have always faced the same fork in the road, when the cost of debt becomes greater than the ability to manage it. Only two real options remain: open default or covert devaluation. One destroys confidence, the other disguises the damage, and no government, especially not the world's reserve currency issuer, will choose open default. Now let me show you how the modern version of devaluation is already taking shape, quietly and systematically. The first major sign came with the creation of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. On January 23, 2025, the President signed an executive order authorizing the U.S. Treasury to acquire, hold, and manage Bitcoin as a national strategic asset, while the public narrative framed this as a move to support innovation, protect American competitiveness, and prevent China from dominating the digital currency landscape. The real purpose is far more consequential. The federal government already controls a substantial amount of Bitcoin seized through criminal enforcement actions over 110,000 BTC, but the new directive opens the door for far more. Under this framework, the government can accumulate Bitcoin through a wide range of methods that do not require visible market purchases. These include seizures, legal settlements with cryptocurrency companies, tax enforcement penalties, regulatory actions, and even government-operated mining programs using surplus or stranded energy resources. In other words, the government can grow its holdings without triggering price spikes or public scrutiny. And this accumulation phase is essential because the endgame is not to hold Bitcoin, it is to revalue it. The blueprint is identical to what Roosevelt did with gold. First, you consolidate the asset. Then, you redefine its value. Imagine the US quietly acquiring 1 million Bitcoin through seizures, settlements, and indirect purchases at an average cost far below market value. Once the government holds enough of the supply, it gains the power to dictate the strategic valuation. With one policy announcement, the Treasury could declare that, for reserve accounting purposes, Bitcoin is valued at $1 million per coin, regardless of the market price. This would instantly convert a $120 billion acquisition cost into $1 trillion of balance sheet strength. The public would be told that the change is necessary to stabilize the system, secure leadership in the digital economy, and protect the nation from foreign threats. But beneath that rhetoric lies the true intention: to create reserve assets that can be revalued upward while the dollar is allowed to slide downward. And the moment the government assigns a strategic valuation to Bitcoin, the market will be forced to revise its expectations. This is not speculation. This is how monetary anchoring works. When the largest, most powerful institution on Earth establishes a new baseline value for a scarce asset, the market will gradually converge to that range. But Bitcoin is only half of the machinery. The second half, the part with the deepest historical precedent, is gold. For decades, gold has been treated as a relic of the old monetary system. But behind closed doors, central banks around the world have been stockpiling it at the fastest pace since the 1950s. China, Russia, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, every major geopolitical rival of the United States has been quietly increasing its gold reserves. And the U.S., despite being the largest holder of gold in the world, has made no move to update its official valuation since the Nixon era. This is not an oversight. It is a prelude. The United States values its gold at $40.22 per ounce, a price disconnected from reality. At the current market level of around $1,800 per ounce, America's gold is worth more than $700 billion. But on the government's books, it shows up as only $11 billion. Why keep it artificially low? Because it allows for an explosive revaluation event in the future, one that transforms a stagnant asset into a multi-trillion-dollar instrument for stabilizing the federal balance sheet. If gold is revalued to $20,000 per ounce, the U.S. instantly creates $5.2 trillion in new asset value. This is not fantasy. It is arithmetic. And when combined with the Bitcoin revaluation, the government gains over $6 trillion in new accounting strength without repaying a single dollar of debt. But here's the part that affects every American more directly. These reevaluations cannot occur without lowering the value of the dollar at the same time. Gold doesn't rise in a vacuum. Bitcoin doesn't rise in isolation. When they go up, it means the denominator, the dollar, is going down. This is the hidden tax of monetary resets. It transfers wealth from anyone holding dollars or dollar-denominated assets into the hands of the institutions holding the revalued reserves. Let me show you how this plays out in real life. If you have $100,000 in savings, you feel reasonably secure. But if the purchasing power of the dollar drops by 50 to 70% over a 3-year window as it did in previous resets, your $100,000 now buys what $30,000 used to buy. Your savings didn't vanish, its value did. Meanwhile, the government's $37 trillion debt experiences the same effect but in reverse. If the dollar weakens, the real burden of the debt collapses. A $37 trillion obligation can shrink to the equivalent of $12 trillion or even lower in real terms once inflation has done its work. This is how debt disappears without being paid. It dissolves under a rising tide of asset revaluation and currency dilution. Now let's address the global dimension. Because the United States cannot pull off a reset of this magnitude alone. It needs the world to respond in predictable ways. And right now, global behavior is aligning perfectly with what a coordinated reset requires. The BRICS nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have spent the last decade reducing their reliance on the US dollar. They have built parallel payment systems, expanded trade agreements that bypass the dollar, and accumulated massive gold reserves. By some estimates, China alone may hold 5,000 to 6,000 tons of hidden gold reserves. Russia has been shifting aggressively into gold since 2014. India continues to buy gold at a rapid pace. These nations are preparing for a world where gold returns to the center of the monetary system and where the dollar's dominance is weakened. This shift actually benefits the United States in one crucial way. If global players also embrace gold revaluation even unofficially, it reinforces the legitimacy of America's own reset. A rising global gold price makes the U.S. revaluation appear natural, not forced. It presents the public with a narrative of global realignment rather than domestic manipulation. This is why what appears to be geopolitical fragmentation is actually part of a larger, converging outcome. Everyone has too much debt. Everyone needs a reset. Gold is the universal tool to achieve it. What differs in the US case is the addition of Bitcoin, a digital asset that allows the United States to position itself as both the architect of the future and the beneficiary of the past. This is not a pivot to innovation. It is a pivot to survival. Now that the global context is clear, we can finally turn to the centerpiece of this developing reset, the impact on the dollar itself. Because every revaluation of gold or Bitcoin is, by definition, a revaluation of the dollar in the opposite direction. This is the part few people talk about publicly. Yet it is the mechanism that makes the entire strategy work. And once you understand it, the entire plan becomes undeniable. When a government revalues its strategic assets upward, it simultaneously reduces the real value of its currency downward. It's a two-sided equation. Gold and Bitcoin cannot rise dramatically in price unless the dollar falls. And when the dollar falls, everything priced in dollars rises. Food, rent, energy, cars, healthcare, insurance, education. Every necessity becomes more expensive not because these items changed, but because the measuring tool, the dollar, weakened. Let me show you how this unfolds in real terms. Imagine a person today with $100,000 in savings. They believe they're prepared for emergencies, perhaps even retirement. But in a system where the dollar loses 60% or more of its purchasing power during a controlled reset, that $100,000 begins to function like $40,000, then $30,000, then even less. Prices for groceries double, gas doubles, rent surges by 50 to 80%, insurance premiums skyrocket. Meanwhile, wages lag far behind, increasing just 3 to 5% annually, while real inflation grows at 15 to 30% per year. This is not hypothetical. This is exactly what happened after the 1930 for gold revaluation. And across history, whether in Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, or countless other nations, the pattern is identical. Governments dilute their currencies, wiping out savers to rescue themselves. The United States is preparing to perform the same maneuver, but with far more subtlety and far greater sophistication. Instead of printing money openly, the government allows inflation to rise gradually, while presenting it as an unfortunate consequence of global events. Instead of admitting the debt is unpayable, they emphasize economic challenges and unforeseen fiscal pressures. Instead of telling the public the dollar is being weakened intentionally, they frame rising prices as temporary, cyclical, or unrelated to policy decisions. And instead of pulling a single lever as Roosevelt did, they now have to powerful assets to reprice: gold and Bitcoin. Let's walk through exactly how a modern revaluation cycle might unfold. Step 1 is accumulation. As discussed earlier, the U.S. is acquiring Bitcoin quietly through seizures, settlements, and indirect channels. Gold, meanwhile, already sits in federal vaults, thousands of tons of it valued at a price so low it might as well be fictional. This accumulation stage is where the government builds the ammunition for the reset. Step 2 is pressure. This comes in the form of a debt ceiling crisis, a bond market sell-off, a rise in interest rates, or geopolitical instability. It doesn't matter what form the crisis takes. What matters is that the narrative is in place. A moment arises where policymakers claim the system requires extraordinary measures. Step 3 is revaluation. Under the guise of stabilizing the financial system, the government formally raises the valuations of Bitcoin and gold on its balance sheet. Bitcoin may be assigned a strategic value of $1 million per coin. Gold may be marked to $15,000 or $20,000 per ounce. Overnight, trillions in new accounting value appear on the federal balance sheet. The government announces that the reset strengthens America's financial footing, restores confidence, and modernizes the monetary system. Step 4 is inflation. The public begins to experience rapidly rising prices as the hidden cost of the reset. This inflation is explained away as a result of supply chain issues, corporate greed, global instability, climate-related disruptions, anything but the underlying monetary revaluation that caused it. Step 5 is realignment. As the dollar weakens, the real value of the national debt shrinks. The government still owes $37 trillion nominally, but in real terms, the burden falls to $14 trillion, then $12 trillion, maybe even lower. The debt is not paid. It is a race through currency debasement. I want to show you how this inflationary phase impacts different groups, because not everyone suffers equally. In fact, some gain enormous wealth while others lose everything. Savers, for example, are hit the hardest. Inflation destroys the purchasing power of cash. A person with a fixed income finds that every year they can afford less. Bondholders, including pension funds, insurance companies, retirement plans, and ordinary investors, are devastated. Government bonds are repaid in dollars that are worth far less than when they were issued. Their real return becomes deeply negative. Large institutions absorb this loss, but so do millions of ordinary people whose pensions depend on those bonds. The middle class, already pressured by rising living costs, is squeezed even further. Wages fail to keep pace with inflation. Mortgage rates rise. Rent spirals upward. Families fall behind not because they did anything wrong, but because the system was designed to transfer wealth upward. Retirees are among the most vulnerable. Their savings, fixed incomes, annuities, and pensions are devalued quietly, month by month, without any explicit announcement. The money they spent decades building evaporates not in nominal terms, but in real-world utility. But while some lose, others gain. The U.S. government becomes the biggest winner, because the reset cuts its real debt burden by trillions of dollars. It emerges stronger without ever admitting failure. Large institutions and hedge funds that anticipated the revaluation, those who gathered gold, Bitcoin, real estate, and commodities, see massive gains as hard assets soar. Wealthy individuals with diversified assets protect themselves naturally. Their portfolios inflate with the rising price of everything real: land, companies, metals, energy, equities, and digital scarcity assets. Foreign nations with massive gold reserves also benefit. China, Russia, India, they all see their national wealth rise through the same revaluation mechanism. Their debts, too, shrink in real terms. It is the largest wealth transfer in modern history, executed without a vote, without debate, and without the public truly understanding what happened. Now let's talk about the psychological layer the part governments rely on most during resets. Currency devaluation doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, giving people time to normalize the decline. Gas prices rise. It's supply chains. Rent doubles. It's just the market. Food becomes unaffordable. It's inflation happens to every country sometimes. At no point is the average citizen told, "You are paying for the national debt," through a hidden tax built into the currency. Yet that is exactly what is happening. Every dollar that buys less is a contribution to reducing the government's real debt load. Every savings account that loses purchasing power is another step in the reset. Every retirement fund that performs below inflation is another silent payment toward federal solvency. And the moment Bitcoin and gold are revalued officially, the mechanism accelerates sharply. When Bitcoin jumps from $100,000 to $1 million and gold jumps from $2,800 to $20,000, the message is unmistakable. The dollar has been redefined, weakened enough to dissolve the debt without a default. This is the brilliance and the brutality of asset-driven resets. They don't require approval. To truly understand the scale of what is coming, we have to examine the human consequences of a monetary reset, because every great financial transformation in history has created the types of people those who rise with the new system, and those who are crushed beneath it. And the divide between the two is never accidental. It is engineered. Let's begin with the winners because identifying them reveals exactly how the reset is designed to function. The most obvious winner is the US government itself. When a nation revalues its strategic assets upward and simultaneously weakens its currency, the real burden of its debt falls dramatically. A $37 trillion obligation may still appear on paper, but inflation erodes its true weight. By the time the revaluation cycle stabilizes, that mountain of debt could feel more like a hill, one perhaps $12 or $14 trillion in real terms. From the government's perspective, this is not a crisis, it is salvation. Another major winner is the Federal Reserve. While the public often treats the Fed as a detached policy institution, it is deeply invested in maintaining control over the monetary system. A reset that reaffirms the dollar's role even in weakened form allows the Fed to maintain authority. The central bank avoids the catastrophic loss of trust that comes with explicit default, while gaining flexibility to manage the new monetary landscape. Then there are the early adopters of Bitcoin and gold. Anyone holding these assets before the reset begins stands to gain enormously. When Bitcoin is revalued and ascends to $500,000, $800,000, or eventually $1 million, the wealth transfer is immediate. Likewise, anyone holding physical gold or large gold positions would benefit directly from a move to $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000 per ounce. These individuals, whether private investors, hedge funds, or foreign governments, watch their wealth multiply simply because they held the right assets before the reset. Foreign governments that have accumulated gold are also winners. China's massive reserves, Russia's aggressive acquisitions, India's long-term strategy all place these nations in advantageous positions. When the global price of gold rises, their national balance sheets expand. Their debts shrink in real terms. They are suddenly competing in a new monetary world not as weakened states, but as strategically fortified ones. The wealthy, as always, tend to emerge from resets even stronger. Their portfolios skew heavily toward assets, real estate, equities, precious metals, private businesses, energy holdings, the very things that inflate during currency devaluations. Their lifestyle barely changes. Their wealth does not disappear. It simply migrates into new forms of value. Now let's turn to the other side of the equation, the losers. And this is where the full weight of the reset falls. The first and most vulnerable group is the middle class. They hold the majority of their wealth in cash savings, retirement accounts, and wages, all denominated in dollars. Inflation erodes these holdings relentlessly. Rent rises faster than paychecks. Groceries become more expensive every month. Medical costs surge. Debt becomes harder to manage. The reset strips away their stability piece by piece. Savers are devastated. People who spent decades building nest eggs for retirement will discover that their life savings now purchase a fraction of what they once did. Retirees face a particularly harsh fate. Their income is fixed, their expenses are rising, and their savings are shrinking in value. They are trapped in the middle of a monetary transformation that offers them no protection and no alternative. For millions, the reset will be catastrophic. Bondholders, including pension funds, municipalities, insurance companies, and individual investors, will be hit hard. Bonds are promises to pay fixed amounts of money in the future. But when the value of that money collapses, those promises become empty. Pension funds will struggle to meet obligations. Insurance companies will face massive balance sheet impairments. Municipalities could enter crisis. The financial system will feel tremors for years. Workers also lose. Wages do rise during inflationary cycles, but never fast enough to match the true increase in the cost of living. This gap widens over time, leaving workers poorer in real terms even if their nominal paychecks are larger. Everyday life becomes more stressful, more expensive, and more uncertain. Renters suffer as landlords raise prices to match inflation. Housing affordability collapses. The dream of ownership drifts further out of reach for millions. Homelessness rises in step with inflation, creating a new class of economic casualties. Small businesses face overwhelming pressure. Their costs rise faster than they can adjust prices. They are squeezed between inflation and declining consumer purchasing power. Many will fail not because they were poorly managed, but because they were caught in the path of a monetary earthquake. And then there is the psychological impact, perhaps the most devastating effect of all. Inflation does not just erode wealth, it erodes optimism. It makes people feel like they are sliding backward no matter how hard they work. It undermines trust in the dollar, trust in institutions, trust in the system itself. But this erosion is part of the design. Governments rely on the public not understanding the true cause of their hardship. Rising prices are framed as natural fluctuations, temporary challenges, or purely global issues. Few citizens ever connect the dots between asset revaluation and currency debasement. and that confusion protects the system from backlash. Now let's widen the lens even further to the historical parallels. Because the reset America is approaching has occurred many times before, in different forms across the world. The Weimar Republic in the 1920s printed money aggressively to manage war reparations. Hyperinflation followed, wiping out the middle class almost entirely. But the government's debts evaporated. Argentina has undergone repeated cycles of devaluation, each time destroying savings but reducing the real burden of its obligations. Zimbabwe's inflation crisis followed the same pattern, leading to a catastrophic collapse of purchasing power but alleviating national debt in real terms. Venezuela's monetary unraveling erased pensions, wages, and savings, yet the government's outstanding liabilities fell proportionally. The pattern is universal because the underlying logic never changes. When debt grows faster than the ability to pay it, a country only has one escape: devalue the currency in which the debt is denominated. Every nation chooses this outcome because the alternative, open default, is politically fatal. What makes the coming American reset different is not the mechanism, but the scale. The U.S. dollar is still the world's reserve currency. The U.S. Treasury market is still the backbone of global finance. A reset in the world's largest economy will ripple outward through every nation, every market, every institution. It is not just a domestic event. It is a global monetary reshaping. And here is the most profound insight of all. The reset is not a side effect. It is the plan. Everything that looks chaotic, rising inflation, geopolitical shifts, digital currency debates, gold accumulation by foreign nations is actually converging toward a single outcome: a coordinated restructuring of the global monetary system. America's version of that reset is built onto pillars: Bitcoin and gold. One represents the past, one represents the future. Both are tools for the same purpose: to understand what comes next, we have to examine the unfolding timeline. Because the reset will not arrive without warning. The signs will appear slowly at first, then all at once. Each year between now and 2027 will play a specific role in the transition. And once the sequence is set in motion, there will be no turning back. Let's begin with 2025, the year we are in now. This is the accumulation phase. It is the quiet part of the story, so quiet that the public barely notices it. This is when the US government expands its Bitcoin holdings through seizures, regulatory actions, and indirect channels. Every enforcement action against a crypto company, every criminal forfeiture, every settlement agreement is part of this unseen buildup. Meanwhile, the conversation around gold backing, digital reserves, and modernizing the financial system grows louder. Lawmakers drop hints about returning to asset-backed stability. Commentators float trial balloons. Narratives begin forming. This is not coincidence. This is narrative engineering. By the end of 2025, the government will have created the legal, political, and ideological foundation for what comes next. 2026 marks the crisis phase. This is where pressure reaches the surface. Maybe it's a bitter debt ceiling fight. Maybe it's a credit downgrade. Maybe it's foreign divestment from US treasuries. Maybe it's a spike in yields that threatens to destabilize the bond market. Maybe it's a geopolitical shock, something large enough to rattle confidence. It doesn't matter what the trigger is. What matters is that policymakers will present the situation as an emergency, requiring extraordinary measures. The conditions will justify, in the public eye, steps that would have seemed impossible in ordinary times. Remember, throughout history, governments never perform resets in calm periods. They wait for stress, then act swiftly, insisting they had no other choice. And that brings us to 2027, the revaluation phase, the heart of the reset. This is when the government will officially reveal its strategic Bitcoin reserve totals, a figure the public will not have been shown beforehand. The announcement will come with assertive language about national security, financial leadership, and the need to strengthen America's economic foundation. At this moment, the Treasury will assign a strategic valuation to Bitcoin, likely in the realm of $1 million per coin, instantly transforming its holdings into a $1 trillion reserve asset. Simultaneously, gold will be revalued for reserve purposes. The statutory price of $42.22 per ounce will be thrown out as outdated. A new official price, perhaps $15,000 or $20,000 per ounce, will be introduced to reflect modern economic conditions and restore credibility to the dollar. The public will hear phrases like stabilizing the system, bridging old and new financial paradigms, ensuring America's long-term competitiveness, protecting families and businesses from volatility. But beneath that polished language lies the real purpose: devalue the dollar, destroy the old debt, and anchor the new monetary order to a dual hard asset foundation. In the months that follow, inflation will erupt not in a sudden explosion, but as a rapid acceleration of what has already begun. Food prices will soar, Rent will surge, energy costs will jump, wages will climb, but never fast enough to keep pace. People will feel like they are running uphill on sand, working harder every month, while falling further behind. Politicians will blame corporations, supply chains, global conflict, climate pressure, anything except the deliberate monetary revaluation that caused it. By 2028, the reset will enter the stabilization phase. Bitcoin, now functioning as a strategic reserve asset. Mission accomplished. The government emerges solvent. The old debt is effectively gone. The currency has been reborn. And millions of Americans will be left wondering what happened to their savings, their retirement accounts, their purchasing power, their stability. But the reset is not a tragedy for everyone. For those who position themselves early, it becomes an opportunity, perhaps the greatest wealth transfer of this century. That's why understanding the steps you must take now is essential. Because once the reset begins, the window closes almost instantly. Let's walk through the action plan. The same one your original script outlined, but now rewritten with clarity. Step 1. Reduce your exposure to dollar-based assets. Long-term government bonds, corporate bonds, and savings accounts will lose enormous real value. Keep only what you need for short-term expenses. Everything else is at risk. Step 2. Acquire hard assets. Gold and Bitcoin are the primary tools that survive resets because they benefit directly from currency devaluation. Physical gold is ideal. Bitcoin is the digital equivalent. Real estate and commodities provide secondary protection. Step 3. Manage your debt strategically. High-interest debt becomes unbearable during inflationary cycles. Pay off toxic debt immediately. Fixed-rate mortgages may be beneficial. These debts shrink in real terms as the dollar loses value. Step 4. Diversify internationally. Having assets, currency, or accounts outside the U.S. adds resiliency. Countries with strong fiscal foundations will feel the reset differently than America. Step 5. Build durable, real-world skills. In transformative periods, the ability to produce value, not just hold it, becomes essential. Communities with practical trade skills weather resets far better than isolated individuals holding cash. Each of these steps is about preparing, not predicting. Preparation is the only defense against a reset, because once the machinery activates, resistance is meaningless. Let's conclude with the most important truth of all, one that governments will never say out loud. This reset is not an accident. It is a choice, a strategic choice, one made long before the first headline appears. When nations reach the limits of their debt, they always sacrifice the currency. They never sacrifice themselves. And so the real question becomes, will you let the system blindside you? Or will you step into the new era with your eyes open? Because everything you've seen in the last several years, the interest rate spike, the inflation surge, the global gold buying, the crypto regulation battles, the executive orders, the shifting alliances, is pointing in one direction. A transformation is approaching. A debt that cannot be paid will be erased. A currency that cannot be saved will be redefined. And the world will not go back to the way it was. If you prepare now, you can survive it. If you prepare early, you can benefit from it. If you prepare intelligently, you can rise while others fall. But if you wait, if you trust the headlines, if you assume the system will protect you, then the reset will not just change your future, it will consume it. The next 2 years will determine which side of history you end up on.